Good morning and welcome to Sunday Coffee, Art, Design, and Architecture. We are coming to you from Florida, overlooking the gentle lapping waves of the Gulf of Mexico. My motivation for this podcast channel is to broadcast good news stories, interesting people, and food for thought. So pour yourself a nice hot cup of tea or coffee, take a deep breath, get cozy, and enjoy a break for some uplifting conversations. Today's book is White Pine: The Natural and Human History of a Foundational American Tree by John Pastor, published by Island Press in 2023. John is an ecologist and professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota, where his teaching and research focus on the natural history and ecology of the northern ecosystems. Hi, John.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, is it chilly this time of year in Minnesota?
It is. Today, let me check the thermometer on my desk. Right now, it is 31 degrees, which is actually a little bit warm. Earlier this week, it was down in the single digits early in the morning, but right now it's what we would consider warm for March.
Oh, well, we dipped a little chilly here. It's like 50s all of a sudden here. And so we're,
We haven't seen 50 degrees since October, and we won't until May.
well, to keep me warm in the 50s, I got a hot cup of black chai this morning. What are you having this morning?
I'm having coffee with milk and a little honey in it.
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, thank you.
So let me ask you, the first question I like to ask my guests is, what was your motivation for writing a book about white pine?
Well, I had a lot. Uh, my previous book with Island Press was called "What Should a Clever Moose Eat?" and it was a series of essays about the natural history of organisms in the North Woods. And the North Woods is this band of conifers and hardwoods that stretch from the maritime provinces west through New England and New York State and Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. There was one species that I didn't really talk about it much in the book, and which is ironic because it's the iconic species when you think of the Northwoods, and that is white pine. And the reason why I didn't talk about it is because whenever I started to think about writing an essay about it, I realized that a single essay just wouldn't do justice to it, and it needed a whole book by itself. And so when the first book, What Should a Clever Moose Eat, was finished, my editor at Island Press, Rebecca Bright, said, "Okay, so what do you have any ideas for your next book?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like to write one just about white pine." And she said, "Well, why?" And I said, "Because it's a foundational species of the North Woods. It controls a lot of the flow of energy and nutrients through the North Woods. It's the largest species that there is, and largest tree in the North Woods. And it's also sort of foundational to the cultures of the North Woods, the Paul Bunyan culture and wilderness and Native American cultures in North Woods, all sort of center on white pine. And so I thought it'd be interesting to write a book that combined both the natural history of the species and why it's important ecologically, and why it's also important culturally to those of us who live in the Northwoods. If you say white pine to anybody up here, they say, "Oh, I love that tree. That's my favorite tree." And that's interesting. There's a reason why regardless of who you talk to, it's their favorite tree. And there are many reasons actually. There's a different reason for everybody who says it. And so it's interesting in many, many ways. Personally, my father was a carpenter and a cabinet maker, and most of the wood he worked with was white pine. And so I grew up with white pine furniture and white pine paneling in the house he built out of white pine 2x4s, and the house smelled of white pine from his workshop. When I first started thinking about the book, what I was going to write about, I just sat down with a pad of paper and started writing various things about white pine from my memory, research and otherwise. And it started with recollections of my dad and his working with white pine. And so I sort of put that little scribblings away, thinking, okay, that got the creative juices flowing. But it turned out that it was the introduction to the book itself. And so that's how the book starts. My dad and my remembrances of his carpentry and cabinet making with white pine, and then white pine in the different forests that I've done research in up here.
I had no idea. I've lived in New Hampshire very briefly, but down here, I grew up in the South,
Mhm.
and I didn't know. I mean, these trees are ancient. They're in your book. Can you tell us briefly? I mean, these go 133, 140 million years old.
Well, that's when they first started evolving. The pines in general started evolving about 133 million years ago was the first pine, Nova Scotia, where they found fossil leaves of this particular pine. White pine probably branched off and evolved along with the rest of the pines, the latest pines, about, I'd say 10 million years ago, something around that, 5 to 10 million years ago. And then during the height of the glacial maximum, the ice age, about 18 million years ago, they were pushed south and east and into a refuge in North Carolina along the coast and a little bit in Virginia, probably out into what is now covered by the ocean because sea level was lower then too. But they were just in a little corner. After the glaciers retreated, they started moving north and westward and finally reached Minnesota here about 6,000 years ago, and then slowly spread across Minnesota, reaching their western limit about 2,000 years ago. That gives you some idea of the long ecology and evolution of these pines and how they've responded to the environment and the particular role of white pine in that evolution.
I thought it was interesting. I really enjoyed in your book how people have, especially the American Indians, held this tree to be sacred and how it even helped with the Revolutionary War. Can you tell us about the white pines, five needles in a bundle, and how that related to the Federation of Five Nations? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. The Iroquois Federation of Five Nations, were the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, and they were warring with each other. And this was shortly before European settlement or invasion, depending on your point of view of North America. And there was a leader called Daganoweda, who Hiawatha, which many of the listeners have heard of Hiawatha from Longfellow's poem. Hiawatha was actually a follower of Daganoweda. And Daganoweda called representatives of the Five Nations together and said, we've got to stop fighting with each other. This is just killing people and we're not getting anywhere. But he called them together in upper New York State under a big giant white pine and towering over everything else. And he held up the needles of white pine are in bundles of five. So each needle is not connected separately to the twig. They're connected to a little bit of tissue at the base called a fascicle, and that's what's connected to the twig. And when the needles are shed after a couple of years, all five needles are shed together. Well, Daganoweda said, well, there's five tribes and there are five needles, but look, they're all held together and they act as one. So he used the bundle of needles, the fascicle of needles of white pine, as an example of how all five tribes can come together and act as one. And so that's when the Iroquois were united as a confederation of nations. And actually, some of the founders of the American Republic, Thomas Jefferson and others, so forth, would sometimes refer to the Iroquois Confederation as a model for how the states can form a confederation together. So it's interesting that white pine was kind of made its way through Iroquois culture and then into the idea in America that this is a United States or a confederation of states. And then the other confederation, a little more loosely aligned as a confederation, are a group of tribes called the Anishinaabe, which include the Ojibwe or Chippewa, Potawatomi, Odawa, Nipissing, Menominee Cree, and Algonquin. And these speak a common language, different forms of a common language known as the Algonquin languages. And they also revered white pine because the pine, being the largest tree in the forest, could provide habitat for a lot of other animals that they also found to be sacred, like eagles and bears and so forth. In fact, some of the different clans within each one of these tribes would take one of these animals as like their totem, so to speak. And so, if white pine is providing shelter and food through the pine nuts and so forth to each of these important totemic spiritual animals, then the Anishinaabe said, well, then it's important to us also. It's providing food and shelter and medicine and so forth to us as well. So the idea of the white pine as a cornerstone of Native American cultures has a long, long history and it goes far back. The interesting thing is that the Native Americans, the precursors of these particular tribes, which anthropologists have called Paleo Indians, they were here before white pine arrived. They followed the edge of the ice sheet back north. And as the ice sheet retreated and uncovered new lands, these ancestors of these tribes would follow the ice sheet back. White pine did not arrive in where the Paleo Indians were until for about another 1,000 years or so after they occupied the land that the glaciers had retreated from. So they were here to see white pine arrive. New England and pardon me, New York and Minnesota and Wisconsin and so forth. And that's interesting that Europeans came over here. Of course, white pine was already established, and we say we discovered it, so to speak. But the Native Americans were here to greet it as it arrived here, as it migrated northward from North Carolina and Virginia into what was previously land that was underneath the glacier.
Wow, that's fascinating. I would like to know too the ecology of the tree. And could you explain to the audience, what is a keystone species? Why you touched on, but why is this such an important tree to the ecology and health to the northern forests?
Well, it's the largest tree by far. There's no other tree that if you look out, like I'm looking out now out of my window at some forest out behind our house, and it just towers over every other tree. It's sugar maples and red oaks, northern red oaks and stuff. The white pine is just towering over these. Its trunk at near the ground can be 3 or 4 feet in diameter, which is larger than any other tree. Sugar maples don't get that big. And it's one of the longest lived species in the North Woods. About it can live as long as 400 years, maybe even more. And all that time, because its crown is so large and the tree is so big, it controls the amount of energy that enters the forest. All trees do this, but white pine, just by virtue of its large biomass, controls it more than anything else. And so energy comes in from sunlight. It's captured year round by the needles. The needles are photosynthesizing even in winter, being evergreen. And then the needles drop to the ground and they decompose and release energy into the soil and also nutrients into the soil that pine takes up. And so it's controlling the flow of energy and nutrients through the food web that it's sort of at the base of all of that, that ends up being controlled or ends up being into birds and insects and mammals and so forth. And so ecologists are calling large plant species like that foundational species because they're the foundation of the food web. And other species that have been proposed foundational, another one in the North Woods is hemlock, which almost is almost as big as white pine and often grows with white pine. And Dave Foster and Aaron Ellison, people from the Harvard Forest, have written a similar book on hemlock as a foundational species. In the Pacific Northwest, of course, Douglas fir, redwood would be foundational species where they're found. In the desert, saguaro cactuses would be a foundational species of the Sonoran Desert. And but the term originally was applied to kelp off the California coast. And I don't dive or anything, but people who dive in kelp forests say it really is a forest down there underneath the water. The kelp is just growing, hundreds of feet tall through the water column, and puts its leaves out at the top, and it's controlling the flow of energy and nutrients through the water column in these kelp forests. So every ecosystem, whatever is the largest plant species in that ecosystem is probably a foundational species in that sense.
And let me ask you too, you said in your book, down here in South Florida, they have what's called a rock pineland, and it's a fire dependent community. So, our white pine, is this a fire dependent community for its seeds to spread, or how does it spread?
It's not serotinous, which is the term we use for a plant that needs fire to open up the cones to then spread the seeds and get the seeds to germinate. And a pine that often grows with white pine up here, jack pine, is serotinous. So that needs fire to, the cones are very tightly held shut by resins. Jack pine produces a lot of resins. Jack pine is actually a different branch in the evolutionary history of pines. It's one of the yellow pines. And your long needle pine down there, a longleaf pine,
Mhm.
that's a yellow pine too. And that needs fire to open up the cones to spread the seeds and then the seeds germinate. White pine needs fire in a different way. And this was just found out, back in the 1970s by a forest ecologist with the Forest Service named Bud Heinzelman. And I later met Bud when I moved to Minnesota, and he was a real hero and mentor of mine and a real friend. He died a number of years ago, but he studied the role of fire in these northern conifer forests that we have here in Minnesota. And it turns out white pine needs a complicated fire regime in order to maintain its dominance in the North Woods. It needs a fire roughly every 30 to 50 years of ground fire to clear out the understory. But the white pine saplings at that point, their bark is starting to get thick and corky, and as long as it's a ground fire, the saplings can survive the fire. But the fire clears out all the other competition, or much of it, the maples and oaks and so forth. And so it allows the next generation of pines to get a start. But then every 150 years, it needs a big crown fire to come through and clear out much of everything. Now, a few of the big old pines will survive even a crown fire because they're in maybe a sheltered area, but their bark at that point is several inches thick. They're really resistant to fire. And then when they spread the seeds in the next couple years, and their cones open, white pine cones open just by drying. It doesn't need a fire to open. But when those seeds are spread, they're spread into a landscape that is full of sunlight and which allows the seedlings to grow and so forth. So The interesting thing is that Bud showed that we wouldn't have white pine forests without a complex fire regime. And this was at a time when the Smokey the Bear was the big thing, and the Forest Service was saying, no, we have to put out fires as soon as they start and so forth. And this research was showing that no, the white pine needs a very complicated fire regime. And now some foresters and landowners are trying to mimic that fire regime in their management of the forest instead of letting the forest burn, to go in and harvest as if they were they were sort of playing the role. They are playing the role of the fire and going in every 30 so years or 50 years and doing some thinning, and then every 150 years and taking out many of the big trees and leaving some big trees left as what we call seed trees to seed the next generation. So it's different than needing the fire to open the cones, but it's just as dependent on fire in order to maintain its dominance as some of these other pines are.
Ecology is just so fascinating.
Oh, yeah. That's why I'm an ecologist. There's no lack of research ideas, but that you get by walking through the woods.
That's for sure. Well, I thought it was interesting. I didn't know this that white pine helped us win the Revolutionary War.
In fact, in some ways, white pine was a cause of the Revolutionary War. The New England was really the center of the American Revolution. Of course, Virginia was a part of it and everything else, but it really the idea of seceding from Great Britain was started in New England, and New England was always at the forefront of the revolution. And part of the reason was when the Europeans came here, particularly from England in the 1600s, they saw these huge, unbelievably big trees, these white pines, and the British Navy and other navies needed very large pines for the masts for their ships. And yeah, I mean big pines. By the 1700s, a ship of the line of the British Navy or French Navy or whatever, the main mast would have to be 40 inches in diameter and about 40 feet tall, no, 40 yards tall, 120 feet tall, in order to hold enough sail to move the ship through the sea. But in addition, the white pine wood was so nice to work with, as my father knew. Cuts easy, it sands easy and polishes up nice. It takes a stain very nice. It holds paint very nice. It's light to work with, unlike oak, which is very heavy. And so the colonists said that there's a fortune to be made here in white pine. And so this is, even though we're British subjects, this is our economy. And they, particularly in New England, built an economy out of harvesting white pine and using it, of course, to build their houses and their barns and bridges and everything else, but also exporting it. They would make a lot of money to exporting pine. One of these big trees would bring what today would amount to about 16 or $18,000 sold to the French Navy or the Spanish Navy or whatever. Well, the British Navy, they were getting their pines from the eastern part of the Baltic, what some people call Scots pine, but the pines in Scotland of this species are kind of gnarly. They're not good for mass, but the really nice ones that are straight and big could be found in Sweden and particularly in the eastern Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And the British Navy was trading for those, mainly because it was easier for them to get. There was, just up the Baltic there. And the Scots pine are on the yellow pine branch of the white pine genus. And because they have a lot of resins, they're a little more supple than white pine is. So they could bend before the wind. And so the British Navy said, well, okay, you colonists, whatever, you could do whatever you want with the white pine. We're just going to get our pines from Estonia. In order to grow a tree that big, it takes a long time, and they were cutting them faster than they could grow. And eventually they were running out of these big trees. But they could maybe splice some together and make a main mast that was big enough, but it wasn't quite as strong or as good. But then Britain was at war with went to war with France and Spain, and France and Spain, and also Denmark, I think, was a an ally of theirs. They blockaded the Skagerrak, which is a strait that leads from the North Atlantic into the Baltic, to keep the British Navy out. And so the British Navy then said, okay, I guess we got to use white pines from England. And the king at the time, George the First, made a proclamation that he owned all the white pines in North America. They were his. Any white pine bigger than 24 inches in diameter, which is the smallest you would need for a mast, even on a small ship. He said, I own those. Anything less than that, you could have them, but anything less than 24 inches isn't really good for anything. Well, the colonists by this time were making a fortune off of white pine, the big white pines, and they said, "Well, what are you talking about? You own them. These are ours. You don't own them. They're ours." And so the king would send over surveyors and people to enforce these pine laws that were passed by Congress, and they were amended over time, and they became more and more restrictive of what the colonists could cut. And so eventually, this led in 1772 to a pine tree riot in New Hampshire, and in which they tarred and feathered some of the surveyors that came to town and ran them out of town. And the colonists said, "Nothing doing. These aren't the kings. These are ours. We're the." So the idea of what it means to be an American started to grow out of this thing, that the resources that are here and that we as European settlers harvest and develop and sell, these are ours. The king does not own these. The king may think he owns things in England, but he doesn't own things here. And that Pine Tree Riot was the precursor for the Bunker Hill and the Boston Tea Party and the Battle of Bunker Hill. And at Bunker Hill, the Americans lost the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the flag that they carried had a white pine tree on it, and that flag with a pine tree on it was called the flag of New England. And even today, it's still known as the flag of New England. So the white pine and European New England settlers' use of it and pride in cutting it and building a nation from the white pine became one of the impetuses for the American Revolution starting in New England. That's why it started in New England and not anywhere else.
Well, they left that little factoid out because we've always been led to believe it was, a lot about tea.
Well, eventually it was about tea, but tea is just tea, you know. It's white pine. It made money. It was in the houses, at the furniture. White pine is what built the American nation as the way we understand it today. Another little known fact. This was just a fascinating aspect of the cultural history of white pine that I learned. Another little known fact is that if you go into these old barns and houses and stuff in New England, and they have very wide floorboards and beams and so forth. If you measure the width of those, they're 23 inches. And the reason why they're, which is an odd, that's a prime number. That's not easy to divide evenly. But the reason why they're 24 inches is because when the surveyors came around, they could say, well, look, the king said any tree over 24 inches was his, but this board is 23 inches. It didn't come from a 24-inch tree. It came from a 23-inch tree, and that's ours. But in fact, it did. It did. It came from trees that were 3 feet, 4 feet in diameter. They just milled them to 23 inches in width, and so there are these odd-sized boards in old New England barns and bridges and houses and so forth, and siding and the floorboards and the beams and so forth. So next time you're in New England, take a tape measure with you and visit some old uh, houses in some historic place and just measure the floorboards, and they're 23 inches or less. I'll bet they're 20. Some of them probably maybe even 23 and a half inches. Just right up to the edge of 24 inches, what was allowable.
They just got creative.
Yeah, yeah. It was interesting, but white pine was a huge part of how the New England colonists saw themselves, that they were the owners of white pine. They were the creators of things made out of white pine, and white pine was a huge part of their global economy, their trade with France and Spain and around the world. We were exporting pine everywhere around the world.
Wow, and then I also didn't know till I read your book. I was shocked to read that the white pine generated more wealth than the California gold rush? Really?
That's right. That's right. And that's the white pine, the whole thing from Maine to Minnesota. But after the uh, the revolution was finished, then we really turned to harvesting the pine. And out of Maine by 1840 or so, most of the white pine was cut in Maine. There was very little left. And there was about maybe 6, 7 billion board feet cut in Maine forests. And we have good records about this. So we know this pretty precisely. A board feet, a board foot for your listeners is a board that's 1 inch thick and 1 foot wide and 1 foot long. So imagine a square board that's a foot on all sides and 1 inch thick. That's a board foot. That's the standard measurement used even today in the lumber industry for saw timber. By 1840, the loggers were starting to move westward. Maine is still a big logging state, but it turned to spruce, and spruce has been the mainstay of the Maine logging industry ever since. So the loggers would go through New York and the Adirondacks in upstate New York, and there was some, nice pines there. North central Pennsylvania were some really nice pines. And then they got west of the Alleghenies and the Appalachians, and the geology changed in favor of white pine because now white pine is not growing in mountains. Now it's growing in a perfect environment for it. These big sandy outwash plains from meltwater from the ice sheet that was receding. So much of the central part of lower Michigan and the upper peninsula is just a big sandy plain. And that's the kind of soil and environment that white pine grows best in. So they would get to Michigan, they'd say, "Oh my God, we thought we had it great in Maine. Look at this stuff. These trees are bigger. There are many, many more of it. There's miles and miles of pines." And they got to Wisconsin, and the trees got even better. And in Minnesota, here in the northeastern part of Minnesota, even better yet. And that's why they thought that they would never run out of white pine. Even though they knew the prairie was out there, they knew the edge of the prairie was there because the voyageurs, the fur traders had been out that far. But they thought there's just no way we could get through all of this stuff. And but they did within 100 years with oxen and horses and hand saws and axes and so forth. But to give you an idea of how much pine was out here in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, I said that about 6 billion board feet were harvested from the entire state of Maine. 162 billion board feet was harvested from Michigan, both the lower and the upper peninsula. About 70 billion in Wisconsin, and 36 billion in Minnesota. And there's a town here in Minnesota, Stillwater. It's on the St. Croix River, which is just east of the Twin Cities. And it's right on the border with Wisconsin. And Stillwater was a big lumber town, and they would drive the logs down the St. Croix River to the sawmills at Stillwater. There are no sawmills there today, unfortunately, but um, just in the town of Stillwater alone, more white pine was sawn in those mills than was sawn from the entire state of Maine. that's just one town here. The entire Chippewa Valley, the Chippewa River flows sort of in western Wisconsin to the Wisconsin River. That's where Weyerhaeuser, the lumber company, got its start. The Frederick Weyerhaeuser, the founder of the Weyerhaeuser Lumber Company, got his start with the white pines in the Chippewa River Valley. And the Chippewa River Valley alone, 46 billion board feet, more than 6 times, almost 7 times the amount of pine in the entire state of Maine came out of just the Chippewa River Valley. So all of this pine was then driven down the rivers and built the cities of Detroit and Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Wisconsin, the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minnesota, and then further down the river, St. Louis. Much of the old buildings in St. Louis, if you go to those, the wood in those buildings is white pine from Wisconsin and Minnesota, driven down the Mississippi River, and even all the way down to New Orleans. So this generated an enormous amount of wealth. And yeah, more than the California gold rush, more than by 1900, white pine had generated more wealth than all the grain, all the wheat, and everything else that was growing in this country and being sold. In many, many ways, white pine it is the wood that built America, both physically building the buildings from it, but also financially. This is what built our economy in the 1800s.
And then, because we always have too much of a good thing, Henry David Thoreau came along and said, "What are y'all doing?"
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Um, my my two favorite books by Thoreau are The Maine Woods and his journals, particularly the natural history observations in his journals. And so Thoreau decided to take a trip up to Maine. He had some relatives up there. And this was right at the end of the white pine logging area in Maine. And he said, well, I'm going to go up there and just see the remaining white pines. And he took a canoe trip, Kennebec River, I think, one of those rivers, and didn't see any white pines. He saw logging camps, the remains of logging camps, but didn't see any white pines. And he came back and he said, "Well, maybe I just didn't get to it." So he took a second trip up there and went further north, up some different rivers, and still didn't see any white pines. And he started thinking, if you read the Maine Woods, the Maine Woods is actually a series of 3 articles that he wrote for Harper's Magazine about his trips in Maine that were later put together in a book posthumously after he died. And so by the second trip, he started to think, what's going on here? How come I'm seeing beautiful forest up here, maples and spruces and firs and moose and everything else, but I'm not seeing it. Where's all the white pine? And by the third trip, he goes up there and he's still not seeing any white pine. And you could tell in the book, he's getting pissed off. What is going on here? And he runs into a logger that said, "Oh, I cut some big white pine. The stumps were so big that my entire team of oxen could have stood on the stump." And Thoreau's response was, "Well, yes, but the tree itself could have remained on that stump had you not cut it down." Um, and so he becomes very upset about the loss of white pine. And it was after that that he started thinking and writing about the idea of wilderness, that in wilderness is the preservation of the world. And all of that wilderness writing came after his main trips. And I like to think, I'm not a Thoreau scholar, but I'd like to think that not seeing white pine, which is really the symbol of this northern wilderness, really disappointed Thoreau so much that he started thinking carefully about, well, what is wilderness and why am I reacting so strongly to the loss of white pine? That must mean that we must have an instinctive need for wilderness in our lives, because when part of it is lost, and particularly the iconic species of the wilderness is lost, we feel it, and there's something, there's a human connection here that I want to explore. And so the loss of his not seeing white pine forests in Maine, um, I think, was the start of his thinking about the importance of wilderness in humanity and what it means to be a human being.
I can relate to that. Here in this area, I grew up in an area that's surrounded by forest, and um, it was owned by Eglin. Well, still most of it's owned by Eglin Reservation. Not as much as I thought, and we could just run through the woods, and then seeing it just like come down, come down, come down places. I was like, I used to build forts right here, and it's a road, and it
Yeah,
just feels like such a loss.
yeah, yeah. Same thing happened to me where I grew up in a place that no longer exists in northern New Jersey,
Yeah.
the southern edge of the North Woods. It was rural, it was forested, it was, trout streams and everything else, and it's not there anymore. Well, it's suburbs. There's something there, but it's not what I grew up in, and it is a real loss uh, to see that gone. And it's happening. It's happening in the Amazon, but it's still happening here in the United States with the expansion of the suburbs. When I first moved to Minnesota about 40 years ago, there north of the Twin Cities was a very rural area. Um, it reminded me a lot of the town I grew up in. And I was doing a little bit of research there, and I thought, wow, this is great. There's Minneapolis just down the road there, 20, 30 miles away. And here you're in the woods and beautiful small farms. And it's just a beautiful area. Boy, this is great. That I hope Minnesota could preserve this. Well, it's all suburbs now. There's nothing of that character left. So it's still happening. But it was Thoreau that called our attention to this, and it was the his inability to find the legendary white pine forests of Maine that I am pretty sure was a major factor in his thinking.
Well, let me ask you too. Now, I have a few degrees. I have one of them is art. And how did Thoreau's thinking affect and establish whatever the Hudson River School of painting?
Well,
You talk about that.
The Hudson River School, um, Church and Sanford Gifford and those artists, they also noticed this, and they were reading Thoreau. He was a popular writer and stuff, and so they started painting. They started seeking out the remaining bits of uncut land in the Adirondacks and so forth. And that's why they were painting these huge canvases of these grand vistas of the Hudson River Valley and the Adirondacks, in which human beings were little tiny things to indicate the grandness of what the land was like. And then Sanford Gifford painted a painting which was very different. It was cut over muddy, eroding bowl with cattle walking through the stream. It was a mess, but it was it was a settler's farm. But he's painting it not as, look at this beautiful, pastoral landscape, and here's the brave settler and everything. In the background was a mountain called Hunter Mountain, and the title of the painting is Hunter Mountain at Twilight. And Hunter Mountain, when Gifford painted it, was still uncut. And you could see on Hunter Mountain these uncut old growth forests in the background. And in front of you, you see this muddy mess of cleared land. And that painting was a wake up call to a lot of people that, oh, this is what we're actually doing to the land. Ironically, that painting was eventually owned by Gifford Pinchot, who started the U.S. Forest Service. And Pinchot owned that painting and was over to one of the fireplaces in whatever houses he lived in for the rest of his life. A reminder that if we don't manage the forest properly, this is what we're going to end up with. We're going to end up with a big mess. And Pinchot's first real work in restoring forests was white pine. And he wrote a book about called The White Pine, that in which it was a little handbook for foresters at the time, and late 1800s, early 1900s, that this is the book that's going to tell you what you need to restore white pine and how to measure it and how to estimate how many board feet you're going to cut from it. But we're not going to be cutting these things anymore like we're going into a warehouse and just pulling out lumber. We're going to be harvesting these things, but we're going to do it sustainably. And that was the start of forestry in America. But it was inspired by Sanford Gifford's painting of Hunter Mountain Twilight.
From the Hudson River School.
From the Hudson River School. Yes, yes.
From Thoreau.
Yeah,
From
from Thoreau.
Walk Through the Woods.
Yeah, walking through the woods and so forth. So there's this in white pine is this common thread that goes through much of American history and much of American thinking about what do forests mean? Uh, how do we, do we own this stuff? Do we have a responsibility to maintain it, or do we just cut it? Now, I don't want to be too hard on the loggers and the people who are cutting this stuff because they had a job to do, and it's a heroic job. I mean, I've never cut a tree that big, but I've cut trees that were 3 feet in diameter, and it's a dangerous job. And they were building a country. They built beautiful bridges and houses and barns and furniture and so forth. But we were mining the white pine. This thread that started of thinking that started with Thoreau led to no, we don't mine forests. We have to manage forests. We have to sustain it. We have to think of the next generation after the forest by seedlings and what do seedlings need, and how do we provide the proper environment for seedlings and how much to plant and so forth and so on. And that led to the development of the profession of forestry in America, which I am. I'm a forester by training.
And which led to, during the Great Depression, it lifted us, you said again, with the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they planted a
Yeah,
bunch of seedlings.
yeah. The CCC, everybody's favorite government agency, and uh, my uncles were in the CCC. Some of my wife's uncles were in the CCCs, and the Civilian Conservation Corps was started originally to get young men out of the cities into the forest because the cities were uh, there was poverty, it was a depression, and there was starting to be social unrest and so forth. And Franklin Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot said, the best place for these young men to be is out in the woods doing hard work, restoring white pine and other species to repair the damage we did. And so they took young men out in the forest. And Pinchot later said, well, we've really got to get rural men out in the forest too. And they took these young men out in the forest, and these young men were exposed to the idea of conservation for the first time. And then World War II started, and my uncles, my dad, and everybody else went off to World War II. When they came back, the CCC was no more. But many of these young men kept the idea of conservation in mind with what they learned, and they were the ones that started the early conservation organizations like Ducks Unlimited and Trout Unlimited and stuff. And those organizations are famous for going out and doing habitat restoration work. Well, that idea of restoring habitat for ducks or trout or pheasants, pheasants forever, and so forth, was that the idea for that was planted, no pun, every pun intended, I guess, by the CCCs when they were planting these pine seedlings all over the place. And it was a remarkable success story because it turned the lives of a lot of these young men around and made them, well, they would write home just beautiful things. And I have a quote in the book from one young man who was writing home to his family, and he says, "We work in a world alive with beauty more lovely than I had ever known." What I mean, how beautiful is that? That is just, and this was a young man who never thought of working in the woods or whatever, and was put in the woods and was just inspired by look at this beautiful stuff, and we're restoring it. And there was a sense of pride that was instilled in many, many young men in America in the Depression. The CCCs saved many of these young men.
Wow. And the white pine is there for us through it all.
Yep, yep, and there's another part of the thread of white pine and the culture of white pine and the natural history of white pine, the restoration of it in the forest.
That was so inspiring. I think I'm going to leave it there. John, this book is really great, and I want to tell the readers it's beautiful. It even reminds me of white pine. It's got really pretty illustrations.
Well, I did
Um,
those. Those are my
oh, you did
drawings.
those.
Yeah, those are
Oh,
my drawings. Yeah.
those are
I'm an uh,
really pretty.
I'm an artist too.
Oh, did you draw the cover of the white pine
No,
on the front?
no, that was not mine. I didn't have time to do a painting for the cover. I was trying to meet the deadline for the manuscript, but I did all the drawings through the book.
Oh, but they're just so cute. Got cute little squirrels and
Yeah.
little pine needles. It's really cute.
Well, the red squirrel, that's a story for another time because that was also something that Thoreau discovered, the importance of red squirrels in dispersing, white pine seeds.
Well, listeners today will just have to get the book.
Yeah, you'll have to read about it. It's a fascinating story.
Well, John, my cup of tea is gone, and I want to thank you so much for being here today. I know we've taken up a lot of your time, but I do like to ask my guests, what is your next big project?
Well, right now uh, I'm thinking of maybe a third book to go, maybe a trilogy, and it would be about watersheds. And I like fly fishing too. And when I'm standing in a stream fly fishing, I like to think about where is this water that's flowing toward me coming from? It's coming from not just in the stream bed, but from the whole forest. And so the idea of watersheds, which is another big idea in conservation in America, um, I'm thinking of a book like that. But I want to set aside writing for a while and get back to art and do more uh, painting and drawing and stuff like that for a while, and just let the writing part of this rest for a bit. So right now I don't know, just fooling around with a couple of paintings and sketchbooks and things like that, and also taking care of grandchildren. So those are my big projects right now.
Your little white pines, huh?
Yeah, yeah, right.
Well, again, thank you so much for being here today on my podcast. And we look forward to more books and maybe a drawing book from you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thanks. It's been wonderful talking with you. I could talk about white pine forever. Thanks.
Well, for our listening audience today, I'd like to tell you again this book is White Pine: The Natural and Human History of a Foundational American Tree by John Pastor, published by Island Press in 2023. And thank you so much for listening today.